Do you know which country had the oldest social health insurance system?
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
We've already talked briefly about this in this video on healthcare in Germany, but today we are just going to look at insurance in the context of social insurance. Some people believe that social is synonymous with socialism. That's nonsense. People have always been social, and parts of the health insurance system can be traced back to the Knappschaften miners organizations in the Middle Ages. The miners looked after each other and built hospitals for their members. The St. John's Brotherhood of Miners at Rammelsberg near Goslar from 1260 is the oldest social insurance organization in the world. However, we move beyond the modern era and industrialization to a time when many workers, especially in factories, had a difficult time. In 1794, the General Land Law for Prussian States, ALR, was created, which already provided for various regulations for the continued payment of wages in the event of illness, depending on the profession and trade. For example, this was generally provided for well-organized miners, while for domestic servants this was not always necessary, but only if they did not have their own relatives to pay for them. In the case of day laborers, the law only provided for this if the employer was to blame for the illness. But even if the employer had to continue pay wages for the day, the employment relation often ended after just one day. Some of these regulations subsequently disappeared again, leading to the foundation of trade unions and the Social Democratic Labour Party, a predecessor of today's SPD. Continued payment of wages was then limited to 6 weeks for commercial assistants, a type of managerial employee of merchants, in Prussia's General German Commercial Code, ADHGB, of 1861, for example. This regulation at the time is a basis that is still in force today. The Industrial Revolution suddenly meant that laborers were simply needed without any special training but in large numbers. Good earning opportunities brought people from the countryside to the cities, and in the city there was a housing shortage. Due to the growing strength of the trade unions and labor parties, against which even laws banning them did not help, Bismarck felt compelled to create laws that were aimed at the welfare of employees and especially workers. The first health insurance fund was founded in 1773 in Silesian Breslau, then Prussia, now Wrocław in Poland. After that, various local health insurance funds, miners' health insurance funds, and guild health insurance funds were established. Bismarck's social law, which came into force in 1883, stipulated that the contribution to the health insurance fund was to be paid in equal parts by the insured person and the employer, and that the benefit consists of the cost of medical treatment, at that time still excluding dental treatment, and up to 13 weeks of sickness benefit from the third day of illness. Not sick pay in the strict sense, but with the same background. If a worker who has to pay his rent and feed his family with his wages falls ill, the medical costs are usually the smaller problem. Of course, a visit to the doctor and possibly medication is also an expense, but usually only to the extent of perhaps 2 days' wages. However, if you don't receive any more money for a week or two, then you can't pay any more expenses. It is therefore only logical that sick employees are insured in such a way that they are not immediately driven into poverty by a simple illness. Dental treatment was covered from 1901. For a long time, there was still a distinction between blue-collar and white-collar workers who were better off. Continued payment of wages usually meant receiving the same salary as if you have worked, while sick pay was only part of the salary. In 1930, under Reich Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, this was to be equalized, but then had to be withdrawn. The unequal treatment remained in place till 1969 legislation. On 1st of January 1970, workers were also entitled to 6 weeks sick pay. However, some part-time jobs were still exempt, for example, if they were less than 10 hours per week. In addition to a few other points, some of which contravened European law, the current form of continued payment of wages in the event of illness and entitlement to sick pay was regulated by law in 1994. There were later a few changes in 1996 and 2012. Now, only jobs that are not subject to social security contributions, such as mini jobs, are exempt. As the costs of continued payment of wages can be very high, especially for smaller companies with few employees, there is a U1 levy for companies with up to 30 employees. All small companies pay this compulsory levy and are reimbursed up to 80% of the costs of continued salary payments. In addition to continued pay, there is also maternity benefit, which expectant mothers receive during maternity leave. This money is paid by the health insurance fund, but employers must pay a supplement to the maternity allowance. The health insurance companies pay €13 per calendar day, and the employers pay an allowance to compensate for the loss of earnings. As some employers prefer to employ men because they could not get pregnant, the U2 levy was made compulsory in 2006, which all companies have to pay into, regardless of whether they employ women or not. Anyone who then has to pay an additional maternity allowance is reimbursed 100% from the U2 levy. Those who do not employ women will still pay, but will never get reimbursed. At the end of 2020, there were 105 statutory health insurance funds in Germany, which are divided into several groups. Ersatzkassen emerged from former self-help associations such as the Barmer Ersatzkasse, BEK, which emerged from a Kaufmännischer Verein für Handlungsgehilfen in Barmen, founded in 1867, or the Techniker Krankenkasse. The Allgemeine Ortskrankenkassen, AOK, which are responsible for certain areas of a federal state. The Betriebskrankenkassen, BKK, which could be founded by companies with more than 1,000 employees, for example, the Siemens Betriebskrankenkasse, SBK. The Innungskrankenkassen, Guild Health Insurance Funds, IKK, which could be founded by craft guilds with over 1,000 insured persons, for example, IKK Classic. The Landwirtschaftliche Krankenkasse, LKK, for farmers and their families, and finally the Knappschaft, which was historically there for miners and has now taken over the maritime health insurance. Historically, Knappschaft members, for example former miners, have a special entitlement, for example, for inpatient hospitalization. So if a young person is starting out in work life and does not yet have a health insurance fund of their choice, they would probably registered with Barmer in retail trade or with IKK in the skilled trades or with the Siemens Betriebskrankenkasse if they work for Siemens. With the exception of the Landwirtschaftliche Krankenkasse, however, you are free of choice for your health insurance company and can also change during lifetime. Some people also look to see which health insurance company has an office near them. Some health insurance companies only operate regionally and not nationwide. Roughly speaking, all statutory health insurance funds have the same benefits and almost the same contributions, which basically amount to 14.6% of gross income, half from the employee and half from the employer, plus an additional contribution, which is now also split and varies between a good 2% and just under 4.5% depending on the fund. While the statutory health insurance funds had often built up reserves, as they are non-profit orientated, unlike private health insurances, these reserves had to be reduced under Health Minister Spahn so that the contributions remained stable, which now means that the health insurance funds no longer have any reserves and have increased the additional contributions considerably compared to the last year, by at least 1% point, often doubling them. However, it makes no difference whether the member is young or old, male or female, single or married with children, healthy or ill, the contribution is always the same. 90% of approximately 83 million people in Germany are insured with these statutory health insurance funds. Around 10% are covered with private health insurance. The private health insurance policies were created around 1900 as certain occupational groups were unable to insure themselves in the health insurance schemes. Even today, the self-employed in particular are still insured under private health insurance schemes, while employees must be insured under a statutory scheme up to the income equal to the Beitragsbemessungsgrenze. This Beitragsbemessungsgrenze contribution assessment ceiling is currently €73,800 gross income per year. One advantage of statutory health insurance is that the contribution only have to be paid as long as you earn an income that is subject to Social Security contributions. If you become unemployed or if you are no longer receiving sick pay during your illness, your health insurance continues to apply, but you no longer have to pay contributions. Furthermore, the whole family is automatically insured as long as, for example, the spouse does not work. The amount also remains the same for pensioners, corresponding to the 14.6% that is paid half by the pensioner and half by the pension insurance provider, as well as any additional contributions. To be precise, a distinct is made between pensioners with compulsory insurance and pensioners with voluntary insurance, for example, with regard to the additional contributions. In contrast to private insurance, the contribution does not increase with age. If you are a foreign pensioner, it may well be that the foreign pension insurance provider does not pay the second part, in which case the pensioner must do this themselves. There is also criticism of the system. It is felt that private patients get an appointment more quickly than those with statutory insurance. This is partially due to the remuneration system of the statutory health insurance scheme. Doctors in private practice receive a flat rate per month and patient, in some cases regardless of how often the patient comes to consultation. If a maximum is exceeded, there is no more money if further appointments are made. This means that these doctors may be more likely to give surplus appointments to private patients as they will continue to be paid. In addition, doctors or hospitals can charge a higher rate to private patients than they charge to statutory health insurance patients. As a result, this is partially a cross-subsidy. Compared to other countries, however, patients in Germany tend to wait a short time for an appointment with a specialist. As the health insurance funds negotiate with doctor organizations and pharmacist associations, for example, to determine what prices will be paid, the health insurance fund tend to want to pay less in order to save money. At the same time, medical staff wants to be paid and facilitated, such as hospitals have to be self-supporting. Conversely, politicians do not want contributions to rise too much, as this would place an additional burden on employers and employees. Different interests must therefore be reconciled here. For example, some people believe that profit-oriented companies should not run hospitals that are financed by solidarity-based and often state-supported funds. Some fear conditions like those in the USA, where only the rich can afford good medicine and ordinary people are afraid to call an ambulance if they have an accident. The co-payment for an ambulance journey to hospital in Germany is €10. It's almost questionable how much of this is really left over after deducting administrative costs. The continued payment of wages is also sometimes criticized. Some claim that 100% sick pay would lead to more days of sickness absence than in Sweden, for example, where the sick pay is only 80%. Perhaps it's again a question of whether you believe in a good or bad people. The bureaucracy in this area is also criticized to some extent. Also, the person with statutory health insurance tends to notice little of this. They just put their card on the table and everything is settled for the most part. However, the hospitals and doctor have to do a lot of paperwork and submit the corresponding applications for the flat rates per case. This is sometimes only possible with specialized software. At least I don't know of any reports of health insurance companies refusing to cover medication or treatment prescribed by a doctor. At most, it may be that a particular medication is favored by a health insurance fund from another manufacturer because it has better contracts there. Health insurance has been compulsory in Germany since 2009. Nobody who lives here permanently is allowed to live here without insurance cover. Anyone who is not employed must at least take out private insurance. Every private health insurance company must offer at least a basic tariff, which would put the insured person on the equal footing to statutory cover. As a matter of principle, statutory health insurance companies may not reject anyone with compulsory insurance, even if they already have pre-existing conditions. There are no doubts in Germany about the benefits of health insurance and compulsory insurance. However, there are various ideas for reforming the model. What about the health insurance companies where you come from? Remarks, additions, and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.